Joann, are you ready to do this?
Yes, I am.
Okay. All right. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. I am very excited to have as my guest today, Joann Lutz. Joann, welcome.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. So Joann is a licensed psychotherapist, certified yoga therapist, and registered yoga instructor. She's also the developer of nervous system informed trauma sensitive yoga. She's been training mental health, yoga, and rehabilitation professionals internationally for 10 years. Her work is a synthesis of classical yoga and neuroscience research, including polyvagal theory and somatic psychotherapy. She's the author of the book Trauma Healing in the Yoga Zone, as well as a research paper, Classical Yoga Postures as Psychotherapeutic Interventions for Autonomic Nervous System Regulation. Wow. As well as a CE course, Bringing Yoga into Social Work Practice. Joann, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So before we get going here, share with our listeners where you're from originally and where you are currently.
Okay. I grew up in Springfield, Massachusetts, and I live in Northampton, Mass now. So it's
nice.
25 minutes down the river.
Awesome. All right. So let's start, Joann. Walk us through how you got interested initially in I guess yoga, and then more specifically we'll get into your interest in somatic therapies and polyvagal theory, etc.
Sure. Well, I've heard stories from other yoga instructors and therapists that they were introduced to yoga in a personal crisis. And that's true for me too. It was 1970. I was a senior at the University of Massachusetts. And the man I thought I would marry, he left. And I felt my whole understanding of my life crumbling. And also I noticed that academia wasn't where I was at. I had discovered modern dance a few years earlier and my body was coming alive. So anyways, it was at that point where I felt a lot of anger that he had gone, that my academic life didn't mean anything to me anymore, that maybe I was destined for more than marriage and children. So I started throwing books in my anger in my bedroom. And I had a lot of books, but one of them, which I had never read, fell at my feet. I picked it up, and it was it's called Vedanta for the Western World. It's like the essence of yoga. I started reading it, and I felt that the essays addressed exactly what I was going through at that moment.
Which was what?
Oh, well, they talked about if a person does something that goes against their moral or ethical principles, it disturbs the mind. And the mind, it becomes, full of, as if a lake is disturbed by wind and all of the particles from the bottom are distributed. Well, they were using that as an analogy for the mind. And that's exactly what I felt had happened. It was convincing enough for me to vow to start taking yoga classes as soon as possible, which I did. And I was lucky. I found a good yoga teacher in my hometown. She was connected with the Integral Yoga Institute and Swami Satchidananda, who was one of the major gurus back in 1970, or yoga masters, whichever way you want to look at it. And so I embraced that. And I started doing yoga every day, going to retreats, learning all about the philosophy. And it set me on a new path, a very healthy path. Little did I, so what I was doing was I feel I was doing somatic therapy on myself with yoga, because I was applying it to my moment-to-moment experience all day long. Like if I started to feel anxious, I instinctively took a deep breath or went, did a half spinal twist or whatever, and it calmed me. And I didn't know it at the time, but my nervous system was being regulated. And so I've stayed with yoga ever since. It's been a little more than 50 years.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So that's the initial story. And then I became, I got a message at that time. I don't know if it was from myself or from some, I don't know, universal voice, but it told me that if I ever felt well again, because I was feeling very depressed at the time after I threw the books.
Mm-hmm.
If I ever felt well again, I would turn around and try to help people who found themselves in the same situation that I did.
Mm-hmm.
And I pretty much have been able to carry that through, because I worked with battered women's services for a while, which is was part of my experience back then. And I went to social work school. I eventually became a psychotherapist, and I'm very curious. That's why I wanted to know what yoga was initially. And when I heard the term EMDR, I wanted to know what it was. It stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which is a trauma therapy.
Mm-hmm.
And so I took a training in that. I walked into it not really knowing what it was. I didn't know too much about trauma theory at the time. This was like in the year 2001, and it hadn't, I don't think, infiltrated the helping professions the way it has now.
Right.
So I took that training and learned a lot about trauma, because that's, I had to learn it in order to use it. And so I continued on, and people, I have a wonderful community of therapists here. They were all talking about somatic experiencing. And obviously I was already a dancer and a yoga practitioner, so that fit right in with what I was doing personally, even though I hadn't been exposed to somatic psychotherapy before then.
Mm-hmm. Let me interrupt you for 1 second. So when
Sure.
you got that calling, in a sense, when you got that message, that, I think you said if you ever got better, you would turn around and help others. How old were you at that point?
I was 21.
Okay. And when you heard that, at what point were you in your, quote unquote, healing process, healing journey?
Oh, I got that message within the first few weeks of the departure of my
Okay.
Love life, and yeah,
So,
it came right away.
okay. So early on.
Yeah.
So, and how did you respond to that?
Well, I started to, I actually took a state exam to be a social worker. I didn't quite, and I had been exposed to a few social workers at a Jewish community center in high school, but other than that, I didn't know anything about social work. But it was sort of an instinctive
Mm-hmm.
movement. And I also became a hotline volunteer, wanting to help people was the theme that propelled me. So
Mm-hmm.
uh,
So you
yeah,
wanted to help people because of what you'd gone through.
yes.
You were pulled to do that. Okay.
Yeah.
So you um did you go to social work school or get your
Well,
MFT, or
I
talk a
did.
little bit about that evolution there?
Okay. Um, well, when I entered social work school, I knew that I wanted to bring yoga into whatever kind of social work I ended up doing, because it had helped me so much. But I applied for a job to bring yoga into an eating disorder program, like in 1986. I started teaching yoga in a state-run mental institution, like in 1984. But
Oh.
I think it was too soon. There was
Mm-hmm.
no professional support. There was no interest, and I don't like being isolated. So I pulled back from that at that
Mm-hmm.
time. Um, so yeah, so
You're a very interesting person. I mean, you have this, like, intense grounded, you can feel it, man. You have this
oh,
intense grounded energy. When
mhm.
you talk, your whole body is into it, it's moving, I can feel it. What about yoga helped you specifically?
Okay. So I hope that doesn't interfere with you interviewing me, this intensity that you,
No, I love it.
oh, great. Mhm. So, what yoga practice drew me the
Yeah,
most?
yeah.
Mhm.
Because look, people listen to this, therapists of all kinds.
Mhm.
And not everyone does yoga.
Mhm.
But
Yeah.
when I have someone who um, has done yoga and like yourself, who has a lot of experience, I want to hear you
Right.
share
Mhm.
how it has helped you specifically.
Okay. Well, as I mentioned, I used the postures, the breathing practices, and the relaxation, which is also known as yoga nidra. I used them in my life early on
Hmm.
to find some ease inside. But I was very lucky with the form of yoga that I learned initially. It was, just serendipitous that it was integral yoga, but integral yoga is a very moderate kind of yoga. The emphasis is on strengthening the body, having a healthy body, flexible, strong, and to be able to use it for service and meditation. So
Hmm.
it wasn't focusing that much on the perfection of the postures. So I got a wonderful introduction to a kind of, and also integral means that they were integrating various branches of yoga, the hatha
Hmm.
yoga, the postures, the breathing practices, the relaxation, and the meditation. I got an education in all of them, and the class included a section of each of those.
Oh, wow. Cool.
I had a lot to draw from.
Hmm.
Um, and it was, sort of because the teacher came from India, it was, I don't know, it was authentically what he had learned. There's a lot of controversy about the history of yoga and when it
Hmm.
assumed its current form, but um, so I felt confident in that tradition, and I still do. So it was very grounded, um, and I feel that because of that, it was naturally trauma sensitive.
Hmm.
And so I was very lucky. Some forms of yoga are not trauma sensitive.
Interesting. Okay,
Mm.
so talk about how this interest in trauma evolved. I mean, you talk about getting into that EMDR program and kind of like you walked into it and was introduced to trauma in that sense. But uh, uh, share with us more about how trauma became something of interest
Okay.
to you.
All right. Well, I was very enthusiastic about EMDR when I started using it after I took the trainings. I took level 1 and 2, and but I didn't know that much about the effect of trauma on the body and the symptoms and all. So I started using it in a naive way. And like, for example, I realized that a client in front of me who had addiction problems could benefit from processing various traumatic scenes in his life.
Hmm.
So I introduced it early in our therapeutic relationship, but it was too much for him because I didn't know about titrating, just bringing in a little bit of the traumatic material at a time.
Yeah.
That's something I learned from somatic experiencing. So with the little bit that I knew, I enthusiastically applied it, but it wasn't good for him. And I just didn't, it took me a while to get, so I needed more background in trauma because
Hmm.
that particular EMDR training, we were told that we're not going to train you in the whole field of trauma. We're just going to train you in this technique.
Right.
And so it took me a while to find my own center and my own confidence using it in the
When,
most effective way.
and when you did start encountering trauma in your practice, how did you react? How was that for you?
Mm. Well, I was also trained in psychosynthesis. I'm throwing around all these words, but it's a spiritually oriented, yet Freudian kind of, it combines the two. I don't know. Anyway, that's a real thumbnail sketch. So the main aspect of it was in presence, in being present to what's going on inside of you and to what's happening in the client. There wasn't too much more to it for me, but that was the emphasis, which was a very helpful kind of training. So I already was being present, energetically available to the clients.
Mm-hmm.
And as it turns out, that's the main tool that I used. And there were, certain types of clients who frightened me, and I felt that.
Mm-hmm.
So, there weren't many, but there were some. So, so I would refer them to someone else. But for most of the clients, I felt a rapport starting. I felt a communication, and in polyvagal terms and somatic experiencing terms, there was a connection. Let's see what the term is. There was a very healthy connection that our autonomic nervous systems were helping to regulate each other.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was a very uplifting experience when it happened. So I was always looking for the connection.
Right.
So,
Right. Now,
yeah.
did when you encountered trauma, when you encountered a client who experienced abuse, or, for example, how did you deal with that? Because it's
Yeah.
one thing, right, to get your MFT, go to school. It's another
Mhm.
thing to be in a room with someone who's experienced severe trauma. What was
Yeah.
that like for you?
Yeah. Well, you asked me about the early days, so that, but I'd like to fast forward a bit with the somatic experiencing
Sure.
training. Um, I realized that what was important was what was happening in the room right at that moment. In other words, I did not want to emphasize or focus on what happened to the person a long time ago, although that was very important to the person to tell me about, to create a therapeutic relationship, a bond.
Mm-hmm.
But in fact, what I'm interested in is what's happening in their body, right, and their mind, right in front of me, because that's what's available to work with. Really, the trauma story is like a frozen memory. You can't change it.
Right.
So I would start listening to a person, and when if I noticed that when they're telling the story their nervous system became dysregulated, that I would stop, say, oh, I'd explain ahead of time that I might interrupt them from time to time to help them process the trauma.
Mm-hmm.
So when I saw this dysregulation through tension in the facial muscles, or a change in their voice, or a tightening of the muscles in their body, I would have them pause and say, let's pause for a moment. And I think I can help you to tell this story better, or something to that effect, if we take a few deep breaths, if we do a half spinal twist, or a full forward bend, or a seated cobra, assuming I would have already educated them in what those were.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah. So then they were people who were willing to do that. We made an agreement ahead of time. And so I would suggest that they keep doing it until I could see that they had re-regulated themselves, that they were present, that I could connect with them, energetically.
Mm-hmm.
And then they could continue on the story. And I would, so in that way, I felt like I was with the client, and and giving them a lot of freedom and space to go where they wanted to.
Mm-hmm.
But I also, in some ways, was the master of what was happening,
Mm-hmm.
because I had something to offer.
Now, so when you started somatic experiencing, help us understand the kind of chronology there of your practice as a professional, as a psychotherapist? How many years had you been practicing as a psychotherapist before you started SE?
Let's see, about 16 years.
Wow. Okay, so for a while.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Um, and I guess I'm curious, Joann, of your initial responses to working with people who'd experienced trauma, because for a lot of people, I mean, it can be really, really challenging. I mean, trauma is, you know, horrible. But how was it for you when you started working with people? When
Yeah.
you started working with people?
Yeah. Well, again, so we're sort of turning the clock back now.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, it seems, I do deal with what's happening in the moment in my work. So, it does, like, it's not really working for me to rewind the clock and go back to how I was 25 years ago.
Okay. It just provides, I think, helpful kind of insight for therapists who are listening to understand a seasoned clinician's progression. Because, to be in the moment is great, but for a lot of people and a lot of therapists, it's really challenging to get to that point where you're in the moment, right?
Mhm.
Those things for a lot of people don't just happen.
Mhm.
So that's what I'm trying to get here is your progression as a therapist, what it was like.
Mhm.
Um, it takes a lot of self-awareness, I believe, inner work to get to a point as a therapist to, as you say, just be concerned about what's in the moment.
Mhm. Well, I had a background of 30 years of yoga, which is a training in being present, plus the somatic experiencing, which is, more techniques, psychotherapeutic techniques to be present. So, um, I just, you know, I felt fairly comfortable,
Mm-hmm.
but there were certain clients who I didn't want to work with. So, like
And
anyone who um felt like they might be violent,
I
or
see.
yeah.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about your interest in polyvagal theory. And, I think we talk a lot about that in this field, but give us the thumbnail sketch for those listeners who maybe have heard it but are not too familiar with it. And again, with the knowledge that, I mean, there are books on explaining this theory
Mhm.
written, but give us your idea, your interpretation, how you use it, etc.
Okay. Well, one thing that it emphasizes is the importance of social engagement, which means that again, some things that I've mentioned, the tone of the voice, whether it's soothing and relaxed or more harsh,
Mm-hmm.
the tension in the facial muscles, um, the look in the eyes. These things communicate safety to the nervous system of the people around. It's unconscious. It just happens automatically. So that's one of the greatest learnings for me from from polyvagal theory, is to um, focus on self-care and to be present again. There are techniques that for the client that have emerged out of that. One
Mm-hmm.
of them is to scan the room for connection with the eyes, using the eyes. Um, so that provides a certain degree of security. Feeling the back of the body on the chair or couch and the soles of the feet on the floor, again, provides grounding, which helps to regulate the nervous system.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in a traumatic situation, someone may lose their sense of safety. And in that case, the nervous system goes to the sympathetic activation of fight or flight. And so the arm and leg muscles become, tense and ready to move with some force. And if the individual can fight or flee, then they will not become traumatized, because they can discharge that energy and find their own safety and feel empowered. But if they can't fight or flee, then according to polyvagal theory, and this is the most original part of it, is that a different branch of the vagus nerve, which is where the term polyvagal comes from, it starts to shut down some of the body systems. It is particularly active beneath the diaphragm, below the diaphragm, so digestion will slow down. Person is not able to move as well, and that there'll be less blood flow to the brain, so a person can't think as well. Their thoughts may be more disorganized. So these are things to look for in the psychotherapy session, to assess where the person is at in their nervous system, and provide the interventions that will help them come out of this dissociative shutdown state and move back into fight or flight, for example, or move from fight or flight to go back into social engagement. And what I have done in my work is I've chosen either yoga techniques or groups of yoga techniques to create the potential to come out of the trauma and go through these polyvagal stages of shutdown, fight or flight, and finally social engagement. And that's what I have to offer in the work. The yoga aspect of it.
Let me just remind everyone that I'm speaking with Joann Lutz. Her book is called Trauma Healing in the Yoga Zone. Why did you write the book?
Well, I developed a training program based on what I knew about yoga and also what I had learned about somatic psychology and trauma, and also neuroscience research. And so I just had the desire to tape one of my trainings, which I did, and then I used the transcript of that to write a book. It just seemed like a natural thing to do to me. I mean, where the actual idea for a book came from, I'd have to really think about that. But I'm describing more how it came about.
And who's it for?
It's for psychotherapists, yoga teachers, and anyone who's interested in this topic. It's not written for the client.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, I've talked to other guests who've been on here, other yogis, and one of the things that's very curious to me is when people start to do yoga, they might not be aware of feelings that do come up, right? Somatic experiences, sensations that do come up, that do maybe trigger them. When you're working with people, what kind of introduction do you give? How do you work with that, and so forth?
Yeah. Well, I had mentioned titration, which means that my inclusion of yoga in the session, it's not about teaching yoga. It's just giving them as much as they need to come back into regulation, so that I might, a half spinal twist, is you twist slowly, twist from the waist to the, right up the torso and to the head, and finally you're looking around behind you. So for a particular client, I might only have them start the twist and do it for 1 inch, 2 inches, or go very slowly to see what they experience in their body, twisting 1 inch, 2 inches, because different experiences and sensations come up. That's not the way I would do it in a yoga class, but it is a very safe way of introducing all of these yoga techniques that I use. So so I know I've learned how to break everything down, and I would watch the person and ask them to tell me if they feel uncomfortable. So I think it minimizes the risk of that happening. So, and for some people who may not be used to moving their body, or maybe in a kind of shutdown, I could start by asking them just to bend and straighten their finger and do it successfully. Tell me if they can describe anything about what it feels like the tightness of the skin, or the tension of the knuckle, or whatever, and then expand it from there. So the whole idea is to guide someone very slowly and safely into an awareness of their whole body.
Awesome. Joann, as we wind down here, what's the best way for people to get in contact with you?
Yeah. Well, I have a website. It's my name, www. I mean, I have several of them actually, but I'll use this one because it's the simplest one.
Okay.
JoannLutz.com.
Okay.
JoannLutz.com.
All right.
Yeah.
We'll have that linked up at the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. So, one of the things that you said throughout this interview, and that really intrigues me and I love, is your value of being in the present moment. And you said you developed that over the course of many years through yoga
and dance
and dance, of course. Now, how integral do you feel that is to develop, and how challenging do you feel it is to develop that presence, that ability for therapists?
Well, in this culture, currently, it can be a challenge because a lot of us walk around in a state of fight or flight a lot of the day, and because time is pressing down on us, and time is like to me an antagonist to presence. So it could involve a change of lifestyle, which is a big order. And a disregard for, for running one's life on the clock, and somewhat of a disregard, not a disregard, but a de-emphasizing one's, one's wealth, one's, time is money kind of attitude. So it's asking a lot. Yeah. But I think that is, it is necessary. I suggest that therapists start putting the needs of their body first. And, that's not very popular among the majority of therapists, but there are a growing number of therapists who are also yoga teachers because they've noticed how much it helped them. Right. And so they've expanded their expertise to both, and they're integrating them, as I have done. And so another, for the therapist to gain presence is have it on a regulated nervous system. It means the same thing on a, in a more, embodied medical kind of way of describing presence. Like get enough exercise, do some kind of meditative movement practice. Right. Make sure that, move at a pace that's comfortable for you. Awesome. That kind of thing. They're self-care recommendations.
Joann, you are a wealth of knowledge and inspiration, and I'd love to have you back.
Thank you.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much for taking the time. Joann Lutz, her website is joannlutz.com. Again, we'll have that linked up at the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. And her book is called Trauma Healing in the Yoga Zone. Joann, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's a pleasure talking to you, Guy.